She stepped off that train worth exactly $200 in a train ticket. But 3 days later, when Pine Ridge was buried alive under 10 feet of snow, Sigrid Larsen became priceless. They called her the purchased wife, whispered it behind gloved hands at the general store, muttered it over coffee at the diner, and worst of all, said it loud enough for her to hear as she walked past the church steps every Sunday morning. The townspeople of Pine Ridge, Montana, had watched plenty of mail-order brides arrive on the weekly train, but something about this one, with her blonde braids and careful English, made their tongues wag faster than usual. What they didn't know, as they watched her struggle with American customs and stumble over English phrases, was that where Sigrid came from, women didn't just survive the harsh winters, they conquered them. Her bloodline stretched back to Viking raiders who had navigated ice storms that would have killed weaker souls, who had faced down wolves and death itself in the frozen wastelands of Norway. The folks of Pine Ridge thought they were getting a quiet Norwegian wife who would cook, clean, and keep her head down. They had no idea they were getting a warrior whose ancestors had survived things that would make a Montana winter look like a spring afternoon. But first, she had to meet the man who thought he owned her. The train's whistle cut through the September air like a blade, announcing another arrival to Pine Ridge. Steam hissed from the great iron beast as it ground to a halt, its cars groaning under the weight of dreams and desperation. Sigrid Larsen stepped onto the wooden platform, her worn leather satchel clutched in one hand, a wrinkled letter in the other. The platform buzzed with the usual mix of curiosity and commerce. Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house craned her neck to see who had arrived. Young Billy Morrison kicked at the dust, hoping for excitement. And there, standing apart from the small crowd, with his hat in his hands and doubt written across his weathered face, was Thomas Mitchell. He was shorter than his letters had suggested. That was Sigrid's first thought. Her second was that the disappointment flickering in his gray eyes was going to make this arrangement even more difficult than she had feared. "Miss Larsen?" His voice carried the slow drawl of someone born to wide-open spaces, but underneath it was uncertainty, as if he hoped she might correct him, might tell him she was someone else entirely. "Yes, Mr. Mitchell." Sigrid's English came carefully, each word weighed and measured. She had practiced this moment during the long journey from New York, rehearsing phrases in the mirror of her cramped train compartment. But standing here, under the curious stares of Pine Ridge's residents, the words felt clumsy in her mouth. Thomas looked her up and down with the practiced eye of a man evaluating livestock. Sigrid felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her chin up. Back home in Stavanger, she had endured worse inspections from men who thought her father's debts gave them certain rights. "You're taller than I expected," Thomas said finally. "I am as God made me," Sigrid replied, her accent thickening with annoyance. A woman nearby, Mrs. Campbell, if Sigrid remembered the introductions correctly from Thomas's letters, leaned closer to her companion. "Foreign," she whispered, loud enough to be heard. "Probably doesn't even speak proper English." Sigrid's jaw tightened. She understood more than they thought. Thomas cleared his throat, perhaps sensing the tension. "Well then, let's get you settled." He reached for her satchel, but Sigrid pulled it closer to her chest. "I can manage," and she said, "Suit yourself." Thomas replaced his hat and gestured toward a wagon hitched to 2 bay horses. "Ranch is about 5 miles out. We'll talk on the way." As they walked toward the wagon, Sigrid was acutely aware of the eyes following them. She caught fragments of whispered conversations. "Came all the way from Norway. Heard he paid good money for her. Poor thing probably doesn't know what she's gotten herself into." The last comment made Sigrid's steps falter. Poor thing, as if she were some helpless creature to be pitied. If only they knew what she had survived to get here. The years of watching her family's fishing business crumble after her father's death. The mounting debts that threatened to take their small cottage. The cold calculation that had led her to answer Thomas Mitchell's advertisement in the Norwegian American newspaper, because marrying a stranger seemed better than starving in familiar surroundings. Thomas helped her into the wagon with awkward politeness, then climbed up beside her. The leather seat creaked under their combined weight, and the horses snorted impatiently, eager to be moving. "So," Thomas said as they rolled out of town, "the arrangements, they were all in the letters. The marriage ceremony is set for Saturday. Reverend Morrison will perform it." Simple affair. Saturday, Sigrid repeated. That was 5 days away. 5 days to prepare for a lifetime with this taciturn man who looked at her like she was a disappointing purchase he couldn't return. About the financial arrangement, Thomas continued, his hands tight on the reins. I trust everything was satisfactory? The ticket? The advance for your passage? Yes. The word came out sharper than Sigrid intended. She had sold nearly everything she owned to make up the difference between what Thomas had sent and what the journey actually cost. But he didn't need to know that. They rode in silence for a while, the only sounds the creak of the wagon wheels and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. The landscape was alien to Sigrid, rolling hills dotted with pine trees, mountains rising like sleeping giants in the distance. It was beautiful in its way, but so different from the dramatic fjords and coastal cliffs of her homeland that she felt like she was traveling through a dream. Tell me about Norway, Thomas said suddenly. Sigrid glanced at him, surprised by the request. What would you like to know? Anything. Everything. I've never been anywhere but Montana and Wyoming. For the first time since stepping off the train, Sigrid felt a small warming in her chest. It is, how do you say, dramatic. Big mountains that go straight into the sea. In winter, the snow is so deep you must use skis to go anywhere. The nights are very long, and the days very short. Sounds harsh. It is, but it makes you strong. Sigrid thought of her grandmother, who had lived through winters that killed entire families, who had once walked 20 miles through a blizzard to fetch a doctor for a neighbor's sick child. My grandmother, she used to say that soft people do not live long in Norway. Thomas grunted what might have been approval. Montana winters aren't exactly gentle either. I will manage, Sigrid said, and something in her tone made Thomas look at her more closely. They were climbing now, the wagon straining as the horses pulled them up a winding dirt road. Through breaks in the pine trees, Sigrid could see a valley spread out below them, golden with autumn grass. And there, nestled against the hillside like it had grown from the earth itself, was Thomas Mitchell's ranch. It was larger than she had expected from his modest letters. A two-story house with a wraparound porch sat at the center, surrounded by barns, corrals, and outbuildings. Cattle dotted the nearby pastures, and she could see men on horseback moving among them. It's beautiful, Sigrid said, and meant it. Thomas's shoulders relaxed slightly. Been in my family for 20 years. My father started it with nothing but a dream and a strong back. And now it is yours. Yeah. His voice carried a weight that suggested the inheritance had come at a cost. Been running it alone since Pa died 2 years back. It's a lot of work for one man. Understanding flickered in Sigrid's mind. This wasn't just about wanting a wife. This was about needing help, needing a partner to share the burden of keeping this place alive. The realization was oddly comforting. At least she would be useful here, not just decorative. As they pulled into the yard, several ranch hands looked up from their work. Sigrid caught their curious glances, saw the way they nudged each other and grinned. More whispers, more speculation about the purchased wife. Thomas brought the wagon to a stop in front of the house and jumped down, then offered his hand to help Sigrid descend. She accepted it this time, her legs unsteady after the long ride. I'll show you inside, Thomas said. Mrs. Kowalski, she's the housekeeper. She's prepared a room for you. The house was neat and functional, with clean-lined furniture and windows that let in plenty of light. It smelled of pine wood and fresh bread, a homey scent that reminded Sigrid painfully of her childhood. Mrs. Kowalski, a round Polish woman with kind eyes, appeared from what must be the kitchen. So you are the bride, she said with heavily accented English, beaming at Sigrid. Welcome, welcome. You must be tired from such a long journey. Thank you, Sigrid replied, grateful to hear another foreign accent in this strange place. Your room is upstairs, Thomas said. I'll let you get settled. Supper's at 6. As he disappeared back outside, Mrs. Kowalski leaned closer to Sigrid. He is good man, she said quietly. Lonely, but good. And you are stronger than you look, yes? You will need to be. Sigrid followed the housekeeper upstairs to a small but comfortable room with a view of the mountains. After Mrs. Kowalski left her alone, she sat on the edge of the bed and opened her satchel. Inside, wrapped carefully in a piece of wool, was a small wooden carving of a Norse ship, the last thing her father had made before he died. She held it in her hands and whispered a prayer in Norwegian, asking her ancestors to give her strength for what lay ahead. Outside her window, she could hear the sounds of ranch life. Men calling to each other, cattle lowing, the ring of a hammer on metal. This was her new world now. In 5 days, she would marry Thomas Mitchell and become a Montana rancher's wife. The thought should have terrified her, but instead she felt a familiar stirring in her chest. The same feeling she'd had as a child when her grandmother told stories of their Viking ancestors setting sail for unknown lands. She was scared, yes, but she was also ready. What Sigrid didn't know, as she unpacked her few belongings in that small upstairs room, was that in 3 months, when the worst blizzard in Montana's history would bury Pine Ridge under 10 feet of snow and trap the entire town for days, she would become the only thing standing between her new neighbors and death. The woman they whispered about as the purchased wife would prove that some things, courage, wisdom, the will to survive, could never be bought at any price. But that was still to come. For now, she was just a Norwegian girl, far from home, preparing to marry a stranger and trying to convince herself that this gamble with her future would somehow pay off. The first test would come sooner than she thought. The wedding was a cold affair, as barren of warmth as the October wind that rattled the windows of Pine Ridge's small church. Sigrid stood beside Thomas Mitchell in her best dress, a deep blue wool that had belonged to her mother, while Reverend Morrison read from a prayer book that looked older than the town itself. The congregation was small but curious. Every pew held at least one person who had come not to celebrate, but to witness, to see how the purchased wife would conduct herself, to watch Thomas Mitchell claim his foreign bride like a deed to property. Do you, Thomas William Mitchell, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do. Thomas's voice was steady but distant, like a man agreeing to a business transaction. And do you, Sigrid, Reverend Morrison stumbled over her full name. Sigrid Ingeborg Larsson, she said clearly, her accent rolling through the small church like distant thunder. Do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? The pause was barely noticeable, but Sigrid felt it stretch like a held breath. In that moment, she thought of her grandmother's words. Sometimes, child, you must walk into the wolf's den to find your way to safety. I do. The kiss was perfunctory, a brief press of lips that sealed their arrangement, but promised nothing of warmth or affection. As they turned to face the congregation, Sigrid caught the mixed expressions on the faces before her. Curiosity, pity, judgment, and something that looked uncomfortably like entertainment. Mrs. Campbell sat in the front row, her mouth pursed in disapproval. Behind her, the banker's wife whispered something to her companion that made them both laugh behind their gloves. Only Mrs. Kowalski beamed at her with genuine warmth, and the Polish woman's smile felt like a lifeline in a sea of cold stares. The reception, such as it was, took place in the church's back room. Someone had brought cake, and there was coffee that tasted like it had been boiling since dawn. Sigrid stood beside Thomas, accepting congratulations that felt more like condolences, and tried to smile when people made jokes about international commerce and imports from the old country. Well, Mrs. Mitchell, said Harold Brennan, the town's self-appointed mayor, I hope you'll find our Montana ways agreeable, though I suppose anything's better than all that snow and ice you're used to. Norway is beautiful, Sigrid replied carefully. I am proud of my homeland. Brennan's eyebrows shot up as if her pride was somehow inappropriate. Of course. But you're American now, or will be, once you learn our ways properly. The implication hung in the air like smoke, that her ways, her culture, her very identity needed to be discarded like old clothes that no longer fit. Thomas said nothing. That night, in the ranch house that was now supposed to be her home, Sigrid lay in the small guest room that Mrs. Kowalski had prepared. Through the thin walls, she could hear Thomas moving around in what she assumed was the master bedroom. He had made it clear, without saying so directly, that their marriage would remain a practical arrangement rather than a romantic one. For now, at least. She stared at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of her new life. The wind in the eaves, the distant lowing of cattle, the creak of wood settling in the cold. It was so different from the sounds of home, the crash of waves against rocky shores, the cry of seabirds, the familiar voices of neighbors who had known her since birth. Here she was a stranger, a purchased wife, an oddity to be observed and discussed, but never quite accepted. The first weeks passed in a blur of learning and watching. Sigrid threw herself into understanding the rhythms of ranch life with the same determination that had carried her across an ocean. She learned to milk the cows, though her technique made old Hans, the ranch hand, shake his head in disgust. She helped Mrs. Kowalski with the cooking, adapting Norwegian recipes to American ingredients with mixed results. But it was the trips to town that proved most challenging. Every Saturday, Thomas would hitch up the wagon for supplies, and Sigrid would accompany him, trying to be the proper rancher's wife. She learned quickly that Pine Ridge had its own intricate social hierarchy, and as the foreign mail-order bride, she occupied the lowest rung. At the general store, conversations would stop when she entered. Women would cluster together, their voices dropping to whispers that somehow managed to be louder than normal speech. Can't even speak proper English. Heard she was some fisherman's daughter, poor as dirt. Thomas paid good money for damaged goods if you ask me. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the boarding house and seemed to consider herself the town's moral authority, was particularly vocal in her disapproval. One Saturday, as Sigrid was examining bolts of fabric, Mrs. Henderson approached with the predatory smile of someone about to deliver what she considered helpful advice. Mrs. Mitchell, she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, I hope you don't mind me saying, but that accent of yours is quite thick. Perhaps you might consider softening it? American men prefer wives who sound, well, American. Sigrid's hands stilled on the blue cotton she had been admiring. My husband has not complained. Oh, I'm sure Thomas is too much of a gentleman to say anything directly. But men talk, you know, at the saloon over cards, and some of them are wondering if you'll ever truly fit in here. The words hit their mark, and Mrs. Henderson's satisfied expression showed she knew it. Sigrid felt heat rise in her cheeks, but before she could respond, another voice cut through the tension. Seems to me, said a gravelly voice from behind them, that a woman who can travel 3,000 miles to build a new life probably doesn't need lessons in fitting in. Both women turned to see Earl Gunderson, an old Norwegian immigrant who had arrived in Pine Ridge 30 years earlier and now owned the town's most successful lumber mill. His weathered face was set in stern lines as he looked at Mrs. Henderson. Earl, Mrs. Henderson huffed, I was merely trying to help. Help yourself to some manners, maybe, Earl interrupted. He turned to Sigrid and spoke a few words in Norwegian, the first she had heard in her new home. Ikke hør på hende. Hun bare en bitter kjerring. Don't listen to her. She's just a bitter old hag. Sigrid bit back a smile and replied in Norwegian. Tusen takk. Det er godt å høre morsmålet mitt. Thank you. It's good to hear my mother tongue. Mrs. Henderson's face had gone red at being excluded from the conversation. Well, that's probably the problem, Earl said dryly, then tipped his hat to Sigrid. Mrs. Mitchell, good day. As he walked away, Mrs. Henderson turned back to Sigrid with venom in her eyes. Mark my words, girl. This town doesn't take kindly to those who don't know their place. That evening, Sigrid sat on the porch steps watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. The confrontation at the store had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. Back home in Stavanger, she had been known, accepted, part of a community that had watched her grow from child to woman. Here she was an outsider, viewed with suspicion and judged by standards she didn't fully understand. Thomas found her there as the first stars were appearing. Heard there was some trouble in town today, he said, settling beside her on the steps. Word travels fast. Small town. Everything travels fast. He was quiet for a moment, then asked, What did Earl say to you? In Norwegian? Sigrid hesitated. He told me not to listen to Mrs. Henderson, that she was a bitter old woman. Thomas snorted with what might have been amusement. Earl never was one to mince words. What did you say back? I thanked him. I said it was good to hear my mother tongue again. Must be hard, Thomas said quietly, being the only one who speaks it. It was the closest thing to sympathy he had shown her since their wedding, and Sigrid felt a small crack appear in the wall she had built around her heart. "Sometime," she admitted, "in Norway we have a saying, 'En fremd fugl synger ik.' A foreign bird doesn't sing. I think I understand what it means now." Thomas turned to look at her, really look at her, for perhaps the first time since she had arrived. Maybe the problem isn't that the bird is foreign. Maybe the problem is that the other birds aren't listening to the song. Before Sigrid could respond to this unexpected insight, the moment was broken by the sound of hoofbeats. A rider was approaching fast, his horse lathered with sweat and foam. As he drew closer, Sigrid recognized Jimmy Collins, one of the younger ranch hands. "Boss!" Jimmy called as he reined in his horse. "You need to come quick. Found something up in the north pasture. Something bad." Thomas was already rising, his face hardening into the expression Sigrid had learned meant business. "What kind of something?" "Dead cattle. 3 of them, but not from any sickness I ever seen." Jimmy's face was pale in the gathering dusk. "Looks like something tore them apart." Sigrid felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. In the mountains of Norway, she had heard stories of wolves that came down in hard winters, of bears driven mad by hunger. But something in Jimmy's voice suggested this was different. "Could be wolves," Thomas said, but his tone carried doubt. "Never seen wolves do damage like this, boss. And there's something else." Jimmy glanced nervously at Sigrid, as if unsure whether to speak in front of her. "Found tracks, big ones, but not like any animal tracks I know." Thomas was already moving toward the barn. "Saddle my horse. We'll ride out first thing in the morning." "Thomas," Sigrid said, standing up, "if there is danger to the cattle, there could be danger to people. In Norway, when predators come close to settlements, it means they are desperate, hungry. That makes them bold." Both men looked at her in surprise, as if they had forgotten she could think as well as speak. "She might have a point," Jimmy said slowly. "My grandmother used to tell stories about the old country. Said animals act different when bad weather's coming." Thomas studied Sigrid's face in the lamplight spilling from the house windows. "You think this is connected to weather?" "I think animals know things we don't," Sigrid replied. "In the fjords, fishermen watch the behavior of seabirds to predict storms. When creatures change their patterns, it usually means something is coming." As if summoned by her words, a gust of wind swept down from the mountains, carrying with it the scent of snow and something else. Something wild and hungry that made the horses in the corral snort and stamp nervously. Thomas looked up at the sky, where clouds were gathering despite the clear evening they had started with. "Jimmy, double the watch tonight, and make sure everyone's armed." "Yes, sir." Jimmy wheeled his horse around and galloped back toward the bunkhouse. Sigrid and Thomas stood in the sudden quiet, both aware that something had shifted. The comfortable routine of their new marriage, the predictable patterns of ranch life, the familiar rhythms of a Montana autumn, all of it felt suddenly fragile. "Sigrid," Thomas said, and it was the first time he had used her name without hesitation. "What you said about animals and weather, how much do you know about predicting storms? My grandmother taught me. She could read the sky like other people read books. Said it was in our blood, from the old seafaring days." Thomas nodded slowly. "Then I want you to keep watching. And if you see something, anything, that makes you think bad weather's coming, you tell me immediately. You believe me. I believe that anyone who can travel 3,000 miles to start over probably knows something about surviving hard times." It was perhaps the most personal thing he had said to her since their wedding, and Sigrid felt something warm unfurl in her chest despite the gathering cold. But as they walked back toward the house, she couldn't shake the feeling that the dead cattle were just the beginning. In her bones, in the way her grandmother had taught her to feel the weather, she sensed something approaching, something that would test not just her knowledge of storms, but everything she had learned about survival in her 23 years of life. The town that whispered about the purchased wife had no idea what was coming their way. And when it arrived, they would discover that some imports from the old country were more valuable than they had ever imagined. That night, as wind rattled the windows and the first flakes of unseasonable snow began to fall, Sigrid lay awake listening to the sounds of a ranch preparing for trouble. Outside, she could hear the ranch hands checking weapons, securing animals, battening down for whatever Jimmy Collins had glimpsed in the north pasture. But it wasn't the unknown predator that kept her awake. It was the growing certainty that this was only the first challenge in what promised to be a very long, very dangerous winter, and she was the only one who truly understood what was coming. The predator, when they finally found it, turned out to be a half-starved mountain lion driven down from the high country by early snows. Thomas and his men tracked it for 3 days before cornering it in a box canyon, where desperation made it fight like something possessed. When the shooting was over, the great cat lay still among the rocks, its ribs showing through matted fur that spoke of a hard summer and the promise of an even harder winter. But killing the lion didn't kill the unease that had settled over the ranch like a cold fog. "Never seen one come down this early," Hans muttered as they loaded the carcass onto the wagon. The old ranch hand had been in Montana longer than anyone, and his weathered face was creased with worry. "Something's got them spooked up high. Something bad." Thomas nodded grimly, his eyes scanning the mountains that rose like gray walls around them. Snow was already dusting the peaks, unusual for late October, and the wind carried a bite that promised worse to come. When they returned to the ranch, Sigrid was waiting on the porch. She had spent the 3 days watching the sky with an intensity that made Mrs. Kowalski cross herself and mutter prayers in Polish. Now, as Thomas dismounted, she approached him with the measured steps of someone carrying heavy news. "The weather," she said without preamble. "It will turn soon. Very soon." "How soon?" Thomas asked, and Sigrid was grateful that he didn't question her certainty. 2 days, maybe 3. She pointed toward the northwest, where clouds were building in layers that looked deceptively peaceful. "My grandmother, she taught me to read the signs. The way the wind shifts, how the birds fly, the feel of the air against your skin. In Norway, we call it reading the wolf's breath." Thomas followed her gaze. To him, the sky looked no different than it had for days. Gray, cold, but nothing alarming. "What kind of weather?" "The kind that kills," Sigrid said simply. That evening, Thomas gathered his men in the main room of the house. The ranch hands filed in with their hats in their hands, faces serious in the lamplight. Sigrid watched from the kitchen doorway, technically present, but clearly not included in the discussion. "We're going to move all the cattle down to the lower pastures," Thomas announced. "Storm's coming, and we need them where we can reach them if it gets bad." "How bad?" asked Jake Morrison, one of the younger hands. Thomas glanced toward Sigrid. "Bad enough. We'll work in shifts, round the clock if we have to. I want everything battened down by tomorrow night." Old Hans spat into the spittoon by his chair. "Boss, I've been here 20 years, and I ain't never seen you move cattle for weather that ain't even here yet. You ever seen a mountain lion come down this early either?" That shut Hans up. The next day brought a frenzy of activity. Sigrid watched from the house as men on horseback moved like ants across the landscape, driving cattle toward the lower ground, securing fences, checking buildings for weak spots that wind might exploit. She wanted to help, but every time she stepped outside, Thomas would catch sight of her and shake his head. "Stay inside," he told her during one of his brief returns to the house. "This is men's work." The dismissal stung more than she expected. Back home, when storms threatened the fishing fleet, everyone worked together, men and women, young and old. Survival didn't recognize gender distinctions. But here she was expected to be decorative and helpless, a china doll to be protected rather than a partner to be relied upon. Mrs. Kowalski found her that afternoon standing at the kitchen window, watching the frantic preparations with frustrated eyes. "He means well," the housekeeper said gently. "American men, they think protecting women is same as loving women." "In Norway, we have saying," Sigrid replied, her accent thickening with emotion. "When the wolf comes to the door, everyone must bare their teeth. There is no protection in helplessness." Mrs. Kowalski nodded knowingly. "In Poland, we say same thing, different words. But Thomas, he will learn. Men always learn when winter teaches them." But it wasn't winter that taught Thomas Mitchell his first lesson about the woman he had married. It was Harold Brennan. The self-appointed mayor of Pine Ridge arrived at the ranch just as the sun was setting on the second day of preparations. He came in his best buggy, dressed in his Sunday clothes, with the air of a man bearing important news. Thomas met him in the yard, still dusty from a day of moving cattle. "Thomas," Brennan said, climbing down from his buggy with careful dignity, "we need to talk." "About what, Harold?" About your wife. Brennan's voice carried the weight of official business. There have been complaints. Thomas went very still. What kind of complaints? The foreign kind. Folks are saying she's been spreading panic, talking about some big storm that's got everyone worked up. Mrs. Henderson says she's been filling people's heads with old country superstitions. From the kitchen window, Sigrid watched the conversation with growing dread. She couldn't hear the words, but she could read the body language. Brennan's pompous authority, Thomas's increasing tension. And, Thomas said, his voice dangerously quiet, and some folks think maybe she needs to learn her place. We can't have every foreign bride that comes to town thinking she can cause a panic with her heathen weather-telling. Heathen weather-telling? Thomas repeated. You know what I mean. Old country nonsense. Witchcraft, some are calling it. The word hung in the air like a curse. In 1887 Montana, accusations of witchcraft might be laughable to educated people, but they could still destroy a woman's reputation, or worse. Thomas took a step closer to Brennan, and something in his movement made the smaller man retreat toward his buggy. Harold, Thomas said, his voice deadly calm, are you telling me how to manage my own wife? Now, Thomas, don't get riled up. I'm just saying that some folks think she needs guidance, proper Christian guidance. Maybe Reverend Morrison could talk to her, help her understand American ways. And if I refuse? Brennan's mask of politeness slipped, revealing the petty tyrant underneath. Well, that would be unfortunate, especially with winter coming on. Isolated ranches sometimes have accidents, fires, animals getting loose, supplies going missing. Terrible shame when a man can't count on his neighbors for help. The threat was clear, and both men knew it. Pine Ridge was a small community, and a rancher who fell out of favor with the town's leadership could find himself facing more than just social isolation. From the window, Sigrid saw Thomas's hands clench into fists, saw the moment when he had to choose between defending his wife and protecting his livelihood. He chose his livelihood. I'll talk to her, Thomas said quietly. Brennan's smile returned, oily and satisfied. I knew you'd see reason. She's a pretty little thing, and foreign women can be exotic. But they need firm handling, if you know what I mean. After Brennan left, Thomas stood in the yard for a long time, staring at nothing. When he finally came inside, his face was a mask that revealed nothing of what he was feeling. Sigrid, he said, his voice carefully neutral, I need to speak with you. They went into the parlor, the formal room that was usually reserved for important guests. Thomas closed the door and turned to face her, and Sigrid saw something in his eyes that made her heart sink. You need to stop, he said without preamble. Stop what? The weather talk, the predictions. People are getting nervous, and they're blaming you for it. Sigrid felt the blood drain from her face. You do not believe me? It doesn't matter what I believe. What matters is what the town believes, and they think you're trying to cause panic with foreign superstitions. Foreign superstitions? The words tasted bitter in her mouth. Is that what you call knowledge that could save lives? Thomas's jaw tightened. I call it causing trouble we can't afford. This ranch depends on good relationships with our neighbors. If they turn against us, so you choose them over me. I choose survival over pride. The words hit Sigrid like a physical blow. She had known intellectually that her marriage was a business arrangement, but some small part of her had hoped that respect, if not love, might grow between them. Now she saw that hope die in the face of his pragmatic calculation. I see, she said quietly. And what would you have me do? Pretend I cannot read the signs, smile and nod while people die because they are unprepared? I'd have you be a proper wife. Cook, clean, keep house. Leave the ranch business to me. And if I refuse? Thomas was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was tired. Then you'll find that being married to me isn't the protection you thought it was. The threat was gentler than Brennan's, but no less real. Sigrid understood what he was telling her. Conform or face the consequences alone. That night she lay in her small room listening to the wind pick up outside. The storm was coming, just as she had predicted, and by morning the first real snow would be falling. She could feel it in her bones, in the way the air pressure was dropping, in the restless movement of the animals. But she had been silenced. In Norway, her grandmother had been the village wise woman, the one people came to for weather predictions and advice about when to plant, when to harvest, when to bring the sheep down from the high pastures. Her knowledge had been valued, respected, sought after. Here it was seen as witchcraft. Sigrid closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but every gust of wind reminded her of what was coming. By her calculations, they had perhaps 18 hours before the storm hit in earnest. 18 hours to make final preparations, to secure livestock, to ensure that everyone in Pine Ridge had enough food and fuel to ride out what her grandmother would have called a wolf winter. But she was just the foreign wife now, the purchased woman who was supposed to keep quiet and tend to her domestic duties while the men made the important decisions, even if those decisions killed people. The first flakes began falling just after midnight. Sigrid heard them tapping against her window like tiny fingers seeking entry, and she knew that by dawn, Pine Ridge would be locked in the grip of the worst storm to hit Montana in 50 years. And she was the only one who truly understood what was coming. The woman they called a witch for her weather knowledge was about to become the only thing standing between her new community and disaster. But first, she would have to decide whether people who had rejected her wisdom deserved her help. As the wind howled louder and the snow began to pile against the windows, Sigrid Larsen Mitchell made a choice that would define not just her own future, but the fate of everyone in Pine Ridge. She was done being quiet. She was done being dismissed. And when morning came, the town that had tried to silence her would discover that some storms couldn't be stopped by social pressure or threats. Some storms could only be survived by listening to the voices others called foreign, superstitious, and strange. The purchased wife was about to become priceless. But the true test was still hours away, when the wind would howl like a living thing, and the snow would fall so thick it would swallow the world whole. And in that white darkness, Sigrid would prove that some knowledge transcended borders, that some wisdom was worth more than gold, and that survival often came from the most unexpected sources. The breaking point had arrived, but Sigrid Larsen had survived worse storms than this one. She was about to remind Pine Ridge exactly where she came from and what her people were capable of when winter showed its teeth. Dawn never came. Instead, the world outside Sigrid's window gradually lightened from black to gray, to an ominous white that seemed to swallow all sound, all color, all sense of direction. By 6 in the morning, snow was falling so thick that the barn, barely 50 yards from the house, had vanished completely. Sigrid dressed quickly in the pre-dawn darkness, her movements guided by instincts older than memory. In Norway, when the great storms came, survival depended on preparation, on moving fast before the world became impassable. She pulled on every warm garment she owned, wool stockings, 2 petticoats, her heaviest dress, and over it all, the thick woolen coat her grandmother had made for her 16th birthday. The coat smelled faintly of home, of the lavender her grandmother used to keep moths away, and for a moment Sigrid closed her eyes and whispered a prayer in Norwegian to the old gods who understood winter. When she made her way downstairs, she found Thomas already in the kitchen, staring out the window with the expression of a man watching his world disappear. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, and she saw fear in his eyes, not the manageable fear of hard work or financial difficulty, but the primal terror of a man suddenly aware that nature could erase everything he had built. "Jesus," he breathed. "I've never seen it come down this fast." Sigrid joined him at the window. In the pale morning light, the snow fell in sheets so dense they seemed solid, like white curtains drawn across the world. The wind howled with a voice that seemed almost alive, and already the drifts were piling against the house to window height. "This is only the beginning," she said quietly. Thomas turned to look at her sharply. "How long will it last?" "3 days, maybe 4. The certainty in her voice seemed to steady him slightly. "In Norway, we call this ulvevinter, wolf winter, the kind of storm that tests whether you deserve to see spring." Mrs. Kowalski appeared in the doorway, fully dressed despite the early hour. Her face was pale but determined. "I checked the pantry," she announced. "We have enough food for maybe 1 week, if we are careful." "What about the Han?" Thomas asked. "The bunkhouse?" "They have supplies for normal winter," Mrs. Kowalski said. "But this," she gestured toward the window where the world continued to disappear. "This is not normal winter." Sigrid moved to the stove, and began building up the fire. Her movements were quick and efficient, guided by knowledge that went back generations. "We will need to conserve fuel," she said. "Close off rooms we do not need. Keep everyone in the kitchen and main room where the heat can be shared." Thomas watched her work with growing surprise. Gone was the hesitant foreign bride who had stepped off the train 6 weeks ago. In her place was a woman who moved with the confidence of someone who had faced winter's worst and survived. "You've done this before," he said. "Every winter of my life until this one," Sigrid replied, not looking up from the stove. "In the fjords, storms like this can last a week. My grandmother taught me, when the wolf winter comes, you become a pack or you die alone." The first crisis came before noon. Jimmy Collins appeared at the kitchen door like a ghost, so covered in snow that only his eyes were visible. When Thomas pulled him inside, the young ranch hand was shaking so violently he could barely speak. "Boss!" he gasped, ice crystals falling from his eyebrows. "We got problems. Big problems." Thomas poured coffee into a cup and pressed it into Jimmy's hands. "What kind of problems?" "Bunkhouse chimneys blocked. Snow's coming down so fast it's choking off the flue. We're filling up with smoke, and the fire's dying." Jimmy's teeth chattered as he spoke. "And that's not the worst of it." "What's the worst of it?" "Hans is sick. Real sick. Started this morning with a cough, but now he's burning up with fever and talking out of his head. Jake thinks it might be pneumonia." Thomas cursed under his breath. Pneumonia in a blizzard, with no way to get to town for a doctor, was often a death sentence. "How many men in the bunkhouse?" Sigrid asked. Jimmy looked surprised to be addressed by her directly. "6, ma'am, counting Hans." Sigrid turned to Thomas. "They cannot stay there. The smoke will kill them as surely as the cold. And if Hans has pneumonia, the others will catch it if they stay crowded together in bad air." "There's nowhere else for them to go," Thomas said. "The house isn't big enough." "The house is big enough if we make it big enough," Sigrid interrupted. "We move everyone into the main room and kitchen, sleep on the floor if we must. Better to be crowded and alive than comfortable and dead." Thomas hesitated, and Sigrid could see him weighing social proprieties against necessity. 6 rough ranch hands sleeping in the same house as his wife would raise eyebrows under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances. "Ma'am," Jimmy said tentatively, "begging your pardon, but some of the boys, they've heard the talk in town about you being, well," he trailed off, unwilling to say the word witch directly. "About me being foreign," Sigrid said calmly. "About me knowing things that frighten people who prefer ignorance to wisdom." Jimmy's face reddened. "Yes, ma'am, something like that." Sigrid looked at him steadily. "Mr. Collins, do you think I am a witch?" "No, ma'am," Jimmy said quickly. "That is, I don't rightly know what to think, but I know you predicted this storm when nobody else saw it coming. And now the storm is here, and your friend Hans is dying, and you have a choice to make." Sigrid's voice was gentle but implacable. "You can believe the whispers of frightened people, or you can accept help from someone who knows how to survive what is coming." Jimmy looked at Thomas, then back at Sigrid. Outside, the wind howled with increased fury, and somewhere in the distance they could hear the sound of something, a tree perhaps, or part of a building, crashing to the ground. "What do you need us to do?" Jimmy asked. The next few hours passed in a blur of desperate activity. Despite the blinding snow and wind that threatened to knock a man off his feet, they managed to move the ranch hands from the smoke-filled bunkhouse to the main house. Hans had to be carried, delirious with fever and coughing blood, onto the blankets they wrapped around him. Sigrid took charge of the invalid's care with an authority that brooked no argument. She had Mrs. Kowalski boil water and tear sheets into bandages while she brewed a tea from herbs she had brought from Norway. Wild thyme and elderflower that her grandmother had sworn could break any fever. "Where did you learn doctoring?" Thomas asked as he watched her work. "In the fjords, everyone learns doctoring," Sigrid replied, pressing a cool cloth to Hans's burning forehead. "The nearest real doctor was 50 miles away, and in winter, 50 miles might as well be on the moon." As the day wore on, the storm's fury only intensified. By afternoon, the snow was so deep that it reached the first-floor windows, and the wind was driving it into drifts that completely buried the outbuildings. The world had been reduced to the space inside the house. 8 people crowded into 2 rooms while outside, nature raged with a violence that seemed personal. It was then that they heard the knocking. At first, it was barely audible over the howling wind, a faint, irregular tapping that might have been a loose shutter or a branch blown against the wall. But as they listened, the sound took on a rhythm, a desperation that spoke of human need. Thomas grabbed his coat and moved toward the door, but Sigrid caught his arm. "Wait," she said. "In storms like this, people become lost just steps from safety. If you open that door without a rope to guide you back, you may never find it again." She was right, and Thomas knew it. Men had died of exposure just yards from shelter, turned around by the whiteout conditions and unable to find their way. The knocking came again, weaker this time. "We have to do something," Thomas said. Sigrid was already moving, pulling rope from the supply closet. "We tie one end to the door handle, and you follow it out. But no more than 20 feet. If you cannot find them in 20 feet, they are already lost." Thomas tied the rope around his waist and opened the door. The wind immediately tried to tear it from his hands, and snow blasted into the house with the force of a living thing. He could see nothing beyond the porch, just a wall of white that seemed to absorb all light and sound. "Hello!" he shouted into the storm. "Where are you?" A faint voice answered, barely human in its distress. Following the sound, Thomas plunged into the white hell beyond the door, the rope playing out behind him. 5 steps from the house, he was completely blind, the world reduced to the feeling of rope in his hands and the sound of his own breathing. He found them collapsed against the porch railing, 2 figures so covered in snow they looked like sculptures. One was a woman clutching a bundle to her chest, the other a man who appeared to be unconscious. Thomas grabbed them both and followed the rope back to the door, where willing hands pulled all 3 of them inside. The woman was Mrs. Patterson from town, the blacksmith's wife. The bundle she carried was her infant son, barely breathing and blue with cold. The man was her husband, who had tried to carry them both to safety when their house's roof had collapsed under the weight of snow. "Please," Mrs. Patterson gasped through chattering teeth. "My baby, he's so cold." Sigrid was already moving, taking the infant and pressing him against her own body to share warmth. "Mrs. Kowalski, more blankets, and heat stones by the fire. We need to warm them slowly, or they will go into shock." As they worked to save the Patterson family, more knocking came at the door, and then more. By evening, the house held 14 people, the original household, the ranch hands, and 6 refugees from town whose homes had been damaged or destroyed by the storm. They were crowded into the kitchen and main room like survivors on a life raft, sharing food, warmth, and the growing realization that they owed their lives to the Norwegian woman they had mocked as foreign and strange. "Mrs. Mitchell," said Mrs. Patterson as Sigrid checked on her son, who was finally breathing normally and had color back in his cheeks. I owe you an apology. I said some unkind things about you in town. I called you things I shouldn't have." Sigrid looked up from the baby. "You were afraid. Fear makes people say things they do not mean." "Still, I was wrong. You saved my boy's life tonight." "We all saved your boy's life," Sigrid corrected gently. "That is what people do when the wolf winter comes. They become a pack." Outside, the storm continued to rage with undiminished fury. Snow was now piled to the second-story windows, and the wind was so strong it made the entire house shake. But inside, warmed by shared body heat and the growing bond of mutual dependence, 14 people settled in for what they all knew would be a long, dangerous night. Hans's fever had broken around sunset, and he was sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. The baby was nursing hungrily from his mother's breast. The men took turns keeping watch, feeding the fires, and checking the structural integrity of the house against the wind's assault. And Sigrid, the foreign bride who had been dismissed as superstitious and strange, moved among them all like a general commanding an army, checking on the sick, rationing food, making decisions that meant the difference between life and death. "You know," Thomas said quietly as he found her by the window, watching the snow continue to fall in the lamplight, "I owe you an apology, too." "For what?" "For not listening. For caring more about what the town thought than what you knew." Sigrid was quiet for a moment. "In Norway, we have a saying, 'The mountain does not apologize to the valley for being tall.' You are what you are, Thomas Mitchell. But perhaps now you understand why my grandmother taught me to read the sky. Will it really last 3 more days? Sigrid studied the storm's behavior, the way the wind moved, the temperature of the air that leaked in around the windows, the pressure she could feel in her bones. 3 days, maybe 4, but we will survive it. All of us. How can you be so sure? She turned to look at the crowded room behind them, where people who had been strangers that morning were now sharing blankets and stories, where differences of class and origin had been forgotten in the face of common necessity. Because, she said, we are no longer alone. The wolf winter has made us a pack. Outside, the storm howled its fury at a world that had disappeared beneath 10 feet of snow. But inside, in the warm circle of lamplight and shared humanity, Sigrid Larsen Mitchell smiled. The woman they had called a witch had become their salvation, and the worst of the storm was yet to come. The second night brought the wolves. Sigrid heard them first, a distant howling that cut through the storm's rage like a blade through silk. She was tending the fire when the sound reached her, and something ancient in her blood recognized the call. Not the lonely song of a single animal, but the coordinated hunting cry of a pack driven mad by hunger and cold. She moved to the window and peered out into the white darkness. The snow had stopped falling for the first time in 36 hours, but what it left behind was a world transformed beyond recognition. Drifts 20 feet high had turned familiar landmarks into alien monuments. The barn was buried completely, visible only as a slight mound in the endless white. Trees that had stood for decades were snapped like kindling, their broken trunks jutting from the snow like broken bones. But it was movement in that white wasteland that made her blood run cold. Dark shapes flowing across the snow with predatory grace. Too many to count, too large to be anything but trouble. Thomas, she called quietly, not wanting to alarm the others. He appeared at her side, following her gaze into the night. When he saw what she was looking at, his face went pale. Sweet Jesus, he breathed. There must be 30 of them. The wolf pack was moving with purpose across the snow-covered pasture, their dark forms stark against the white. These weren't the cautious, elusive wolves that occasionally took a stray calf. These were animals driven to desperation by the same storm that had trapped the humans, predators with nothing left to lose. They're heading for town, Thomas said. Sigrid nodded grimly. The storm has trapped everyone in their homes, easy prey for animals that know no fear. Behind them, some of the others had noticed their hushed conversation and were gathering at the windows. Mrs. Patterson gasped when she saw the pack, instinctively clutching her baby closer. They can't get in, can they? Asked Jake Morrison, one of the younger ranch hands. Not here, Sigrid said. This house is strong, and we have enough people to make noise if they try. But in town... She trailed off, thinking of the smaller homes, the elderly people living alone, the families with young children who might not have the resources to defend themselves. We have to warn them, Thomas said. How? Jimmy Collins asked. We can't get through this snow. It's deeper than a man is tall in places. Sigrid was quiet for a long moment, her mind working through possibilities that others might not consider. Back home in Norway, when the great storms trapped villages and wolves came down from the mountains, there were ways to communicate across distances, ways that didn't require roads or visibility. My grandmother, she said slowly, she told me stories of the old days when the Viking settlements were cut off by winter storms. They had ways of sending warnings. What kind of ways? Thomas asked. Sigrid moved away from the window and began rummaging through the supplies they had gathered. Fire, she said. Not just any fire, but signal fires. In the old country, they would burn green wood and wool together. It makes thick smoke that can be seen for miles, even in bad weather. But the storm, someone began. The storm has stopped, at least for now, Sigrid interrupted. And wolves hunt at night. If we can warn the town now, people might have time to prepare before the pack reaches them. Thomas studied her face in the lamplight. You want to go outside, in this weather, with wolves out there? I want to save lives, Sigrid said simply. The roof of this house is strong, and from up there a signal fire could be seen from town. But it will take several people to manage it safely. It's suicide, Hans said from his sickbed. The old ranch hand had been listening to the conversation despite his weakness. "No offense, ma'am, but you're talking about climbing onto a roof in the middle of a blizzard to light a fire that wolves can smell for miles." "Yes," Sigurd said calmly. "That is exactly what I am talking about." The room fell silent except for the howling wind and the distant wolf calls. Everyone understood what she was proposing, a desperate plan that could easily get them all killed, but might be the only chance to save the people of Pine Ridge. Thomas was the first to speak. "What do you need?" Sigrid felt something warm unfold in her chest at his support. "Rope, lots of rope, green wood from the pile behind the house, wool blankets that we can spare, and men who are not afraid of heights or wolves." "I'll go," Jimmy said immediately. "And me," added Jake Morrison. Within an hour, they had assembled everything needed for the signal fire. Sigrid had them tie ropes around their waists and secure them to the house's foundation, creating safety lines that would prevent anyone from being blown off the roof by the wind. She showed them how to build the fire in the old way: green wood to create smoke, wool to make it thick and dark, and dry kindling to keep it burning hot enough to be effective. The climb to the roof was treacherous. The ladder was slick with ice, and the wind tried to tear them loose with every step. But Sigrid led the way with the sure-footed confidence of someone who had grown up scrambling over the rocky cliffs of the Norwegian coast. Once on the roof, the full fury of the storm became apparent. Even though the snow had stopped, the wind was still strong enough to knock a person down, and the cold bit through their clothes like knives. But Sigrid worked with methodical efficiency, her movements guided by knowledge passed down through generations of her people. "Like this," she called to the men as she arranged the green wood. "The smoke must be thick enough to cut through the wind, but not so heavy that it chokes out the flame." As they worked, the wolf pack grew closer. The animals had spread out across the snow-covered landscape, some heading directly for town while others circled back toward the ranch. Their howls seemed to come from every direction now, a sound that made the hair on the back of Sigrid's neck stand up. "They're surrounding us," Jake said nervously. "Let them," Sigrid replied, striking flint to tinder. "We have the high ground, and wolves are smarter than people think. They won't attack a position they can't win." The signal fire caught on the first try, sending up a column of thick, dark smoke that was immediately caught by the wind and spread across the white landscape like a banner of warning. From their position on the roof, they could see it carrying toward town, a black stain against the gray sky that would be visible for miles. They maintained the fire for over an hour, feeding it with green wood and wool until their supply ran low. During that time, they saw answering fires spring up from the town, thin columns of smoke that told them their warning had been received and understood. But as they prepared to climb down from the roof, disaster struck. Jake Morrison, numb by cold and exhausted from the effort of maintaining the fire, slipped on a patch of ice near the roof's edge. His safety rope caught him, but the sudden jerk sent him swinging toward the side of the house with enough force to knock him unconscious. He hung there, suspended 20 feet above the ground, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead where he had struck the wall. "Jake!" Jimmy called, starting toward the edge. "Stop!" Sigrid commanded sharply. "One mistake, and we lose both of you." She studied the situation with the calculating gaze of someone who had faced life-or-death decisions before. Jake's rope had tangled around a roof beam, and he was hanging at an angle that made it impossible to simply pull him up. Someone would have to go down after him, but the ice-covered roof made any rescue attempt extremely dangerous. "I can do it," Jimmy said. "I'm the lightest." "No," Sigrid said. "You are brave, but this requires more than courage. It requires knowing how to move on ice, how to distribute weight, how to work with rope in conditions like these." She was already checking her own safety line, making sure it was secure. "In the fjords, we learn to climb before we learn to walk. Ice and rope in high places, these are my grandmother's gifts to me." Before anyone could protest, she had lowered herself over the edge of the roof. The descent was terrifying. The wind tried to slam her against the house with every movement, and the ice made every handhold treacherous. But Sigrid moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent her childhood scaling cliffs to gather bird eggs and sea herbs. She reached Jake just as his rope began to fray where it rubbed against the rough wood of the house. Working quickly, she secured her own line to his and began the delicate process of freeing his tangled rope. Below them, she could see the dark shapes of wolves gathering in the yard, drawn by the scent of blood and the sounds of human distress. Come on, you stubborn Norwegian, she muttered to herself, working at the knot with fingers that were rapidly losing feeling in the cold. Your ancestors climbed ice mountains to raid English monasteries. You can handle one American roof. The rope came free suddenly and Jake's full weight transferred to her line. The jerk nearly tore her loose from the wall, but her grip held. Hand over hand, using techniques her grandmother had taught her for hauling fishing nets up cliff faces, she began to pull both of them back toward the roof. It took 20 minutes of exhausting effort, but eventually willing hands pulled them both to safety. Jake was conscious but groggy, and the cut on his head would need stitches, but he was alive. As they made their way back into the house, the wolf pack was already moving on toward town. But from the windows, they could see that their warning had been heeded. Lights burned in every window of Pine Ridge, and the thin columns of smoke that rose from chimneys told them that people were awake and ready to defend themselves. You saved his life, Thomas said quietly as they watched Mrs. Kowalski tend to Jake's injury. We all saved his life, Sigrid replied, echoing her words from the night before. That is what a pack does. But Thomas shook his head. No, that was something else. That was... He paused, searching for words. That was like watching my grandmother's stories come to life. Stories about Viking warriors who could do impossible things. Sigrid looked at him with something that might have been sadness. Your grandmother told you Viking stories? Norwegian grandmother, Thomas said. My father's mother. She used to say our family came from the old country, way back. Told stories about people who crossed oceans in open boats, who fought storms and monsters and impossible odds. For the first time since her arrival in Pine Ridge, Sigrid smiled with genuine warmth. Then perhaps you understand, better than most, why I am not afraid of wolves or winter or people who call me witch. Outside, the howling of the wolf pack grew fainter as the animals moved toward town. But they would find no easy prey there. The warning had been given, the fires had been lit, and the people of Pine Ridge would survive the night because a Norwegian woman had remembered the old ways of her people. As the third day of the storm dawned gray and cold, the 14 people crowded into the ranch house had become something more than mere refugees. They had become a family, bound together by shared danger and the leadership of a woman they had once dismissed as foreign and strange. Hans, recovered enough to sit up and take notice, spoke for all of them when he raised a cup of coffee and a toast. To Mrs. Mitchell, he said, who taught us that sometimes the best Americans come from somewhere else. Sigrid accepted the toast with quiet dignity, but her mind was already turning toward the challenges that lay ahead. The storm was weakening, but it wasn't over yet. And when it finally ended, when the snow stopped and the wind died down, there would be the enormous task of digging out, of reaching the isolated and injured, of rebuilding what the wolf winter had destroyed. The purchased wife had become a leader. The foreign bride had become the heart of a community. And the woman they had called a witch had proven that some magic was real. The magic of knowledge, courage, and the will to save others even when doing so meant risking everything. But the greatest test was still to come. When the storm ended and the true scope of the damage became clear, Sigrid would face a choice that would define not just her own future, but the future of everyone in Pine Ridge. The Viking had emerged. Now she would have to decide whether to stay and build something new from the ruins of the old, or to move on and let others benefit from the lessons she had taught them. The wolf winter was almost over, but the real test of character comes not in the storm itself, but in what you choose to do when the skies finally clear. The silence woke her. After 4 days of constant wind, of snow driven like bullets against the windows, of the house creaking and groaning under nature's assault, the sudden quiet was so profound it seemed to have weight. Sigrid opened her eyes in the pre-dawn darkness and knew, with the certainty that came from a lifetime of reading weather, that the storm was over. She rose carefully, stepping over the sleeping forms of the ranch hands who had made beds on the floor around the dying fire. The past 4 days had erased the social boundaries that once seemed so important. Hans slept peacefully beside Mrs. Patterson, who cradled her baby against her chest. Jimmy and Jake were curled up like brothers, sharing blankets and warmth. Mrs. Kowalski had claimed the rocking chair, where she dozed with her knitting still in her hands. They looked like survivors of a shipwreck, Sigrid thought, which in a way they were. She made her way to the kitchen window and looked out at a world transformed. The storm had left behind a landscape so alien that for a moment she couldn't orient herself. Snow had drifted to impossible heights, 20 feet in some places, creating rolling hills where none had existed before. What had once been the familiar yard of the ranch was now an Arctic wasteland of white curves and mysterious mounds that might hide buildings, trees, or nothing at all. But it was beautiful in its devastation. The morning sun, appearing for the first time in days, painted the snow in shades of rose and gold. The air was crystal clear, so pure it seemed to ring like a bell. And in that clarity, the true scope of what they had survived became apparent. "Jesus Christ," said a voice behind her. She turned to see Thomas standing in the doorway, staring out at the transformed landscape with something approaching awe. "It's over," she said simply. "Yeah." He moved to stand beside her at the window. "But what's left?" It was a fair question. From where they stood, nothing looked familiar. The barn was buried so completely that only the very peak of its roof was visible. The corrals had vanished entirely. Trees that had stood for decades were either buried or broken, their shattered trunks jutting from the snow like the ribs of some massive skeleton. "We are left," Sigurd said. "We survived. That is what matters." Over the next hour, the others woke and gathered at the windows to survey the damage. The reactions ranged from stunned silence to quiet cursing to something that might have been laughter. The kind of laughter that comes when you've looked death in the face and lived to tell about it. "How the hell do we even start to dig out of this?" Jake asked, gingerly touching the bandage on his head. "One shovel at a time," Sigurd replied. "But first we need to know who else survived." She had been thinking about this problem since dawn. Pine Ridge was a small town, but it was spread out over several square miles. In conditions like these, it could take days to reach every isolated homestead, every family that might be trapped or injured. They needed a systematic approach, a way to coordinate rescue efforts and make sure no one was forgotten. "We need to get to high ground," she said. "Somewhere we can see the whole valley and figure out where help is needed most." Thomas studied the snow-covered landscape. "The church bell tower. If we can get there, we can see everything from Pine Ridge to the outlying ranches." "If the church is still standing," Hans pointed out. "Only one way to find out," Sigurd said, already moving toward the pile of winter gear they had accumulated over the past few days. The journey to town was unlike anything any of them had ever experienced. They fashioned crude snowshoes from furniture and rope, but even so, the going was treacherous. The snow was deep enough in places that they had to rope themselves together to avoid disappearing into hidden drifts. More than once, someone would take a step and suddenly sink to their chest in snow that looked solid, but was really just a thin crust over empty space. But Sigurd led them with the confidence of someone who had been navigating treacherous terrain her entire life. She seemed to know instinctively where the snow would hold their weight and where it would give way. When they encountered obstacles, fallen trees, buried fences, drifts too deep to cross, she found ways around them that others wouldn't have thought to look for. "Where did you learn to do this?" Thomas asked during one of their brief rest stops. "The fjords," Sigurd replied, scanning the terrain ahead. "When the avalanches come, they reshape the landscape overnight. You learn to read the snow, to understand how it moves and where it will support you." "Avalanches?" Jimmy repeated with something like awe. "You lived through avalanches?" "Every winter," Sigurd said matter-of-factly. "Some years were worse than others. The winter I turned 16, an avalanche buried our village for 2 weeks. We had to dig tunnels to get from house to house." The men exchanged glances. They were beginning to understand that the woman they had dismissed as a sheltered foreign bride had survived things that would have killed most of them. When they finally reached Pine Ridge, the devastation was both better and worse than they had feared. The church was still standing, its solid stone construction having weathered the storm better than the wooden buildings around it. But entire blocks of the town had been flattened by the wind or crushed under the weight of snow. What had once been Main Street was now a canyon between towering drifts, navigable only on foot. The bell tower provided exactly the vantage point Sigurd had hoped for. From its height, they could see the entire valley spread out below them, like a map drawn in white ink. Smoke rose from perhaps half the chimneys they could see, a good sign that meant people were alive and had managed to keep their fires burning. But there were ominous gaps, dark houses that showed no signs of life. "There," Thomas said, pointing toward the east side of town. "The Henderson place. No smoke." Sigrid followed his gaze and felt her heart sink. Mrs. Henderson, for all her sharp tongue and disapproving ways, was an elderly widow who lived alone. If her house had lost its roof or her fire had gone out. "And there," Jake added, pointing in another direction. "The schoolhouse. Looks like the whole roof caved in." They spent an hour cataloging the damage and making a list of priorities. Some houses showed clear signs of collapse and would need immediate rescue efforts. Others appeared intact, but showed no signs of life and would need to be checked. Still others were obviously occupied and safe, their chimneys smoking and paths already dug through the snow around their doors. But it was the view beyond the town that sobered them most. The outlying ranches and homesteads were completely cut off, buried so deep in snow that it would take days or even weeks to reach them. Families could be dead or dying out there, and there was no way to know. "We need more people," Thomas said. "This is too much for just us." "Then we organize the town," Sigrid replied. "Everyone who can work, works. Everyone who has supplies, shares. We become what we became in the house. A pack." What followed was perhaps the most extraordinary week in Pine Ridge's history. Under Sigrid's guidance, the scattered survivors of the storm organized themselves into something that had never existed before, a true community. She divided the rescue efforts into teams, each with specific responsibilities. One group focused on digging out the buried houses and checking for survivors. Another worked on clearing the main roads so that supplies could be moved around town. A third group, led by Mrs. Kowalski, established a central kitchen in the church where everyone could get hot meals regardless of their ability to pay. But it was Sigrid herself who took on the most dangerous work, leading the expeditions to the isolated homesteads beyond town. Using skills learned in the Norwegian wilderness, she navigated the treacherous, snow-covered landscape to reach families that others had given up for dead. They found the Johansson family trapped in their root cellar, their house completely buried, but the family alive and surprisingly well supplied. They rescued old Pete Gunderson from his collapsed cabin, digging him out after 3 days of being trapped under fallen timbers. They brought food and medicine to the Morrison Ranch, where a broken leg had left the patriarch unable to care for his livestock. With each successful rescue, with each family saved from disaster, Sigrid's reputation in Pine Ridge transformed. The whispers that had once called her foreign and strange now spoke of her with something approaching reverence. Children who had once stared at her with curiosity now ran to her with excitement when she appeared on the street. Women who had once snubbed her now sought her advice on everything from winter survival to medical care. But perhaps the most significant change was in Thomas himself. "I've been thinking," he said one evening as they sat by the fire in their still crowded house. Most of the refugees had found other accommodations by now, but a few remained. Elderly folks with nowhere else to go, families whose homes were too damaged to be habitable. "About what?" Sigrid asked, looking up from the sock she was darning. "About us. About this marriage." Thomas seemed to be choosing his words carefully. "When I sent for a mail-order bride, I thought I was buying a solution to a problem. Someone to cook and clean and give me sons to help with the ranch." Sigrid set down her needle. "And now? Now I realize I didn't buy anything. You came here of your own choice, made your own sacrifices, took your own risks. And what you've given this community, what you've given me, that can't be purchased at any price." He paused, staring into the fire. "What I'm trying to say is, I'd like to start over. Not as a man who bought a wife, but as a man asking a remarkable woman if she'd consider staying married to him for all the right reasons." Sigrid studied his face in the firelight. The man who sat before her was not the same one who had met her at the train station 6 weeks ago. That man had been looking for a servant disguised as a wife. This man was offering her partnership, respect, and something that might, in time, grow into love. "Thomas Mitchell," she said finally, "are you proposing to your own wife?" "I guess I am." She smiled, the first truly joyful smile he had seen from her since her arrival. "Then I guess I accept." The kiss that followed was nothing like the perfunctory peck that had sealed their original arrangement. This was the kiss of two people who had been through fire together and emerged stronger, who had learned to see each other not as foreign or strange, but as exactly what the other needed. Spring came early to Pine Ridge that year, and with it, a transformation that went far beyond the melting snow. The woman who had once been dismissed as the purchased wife now walked through town as its most respected leader. Sigrid Larsen Mitchell had proven that true worth couldn't be bought at any price. Harold Brennan found her one day examining plans for the new schoolhouse. The same man who had once threatened her with accusations of witchcraft now stood hat in hand. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology for being a damn fool, for not recognizing wisdom when it stood right in front of me." Sigrid smiled with the grace of someone who understood that redemption comes to those brave enough to seek it. "We all learn from storms, Mr. Brennan. That's what makes us stronger." On a warm evening in late May, as Sigrid and Thomas sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, she reflected on her incredible journey. A year ago, she had been worth exactly $200 and a train ticket. Now she was priceless, not because she had changed, but because Pine Ridge had learned to see her true value. "Any regrets?" Thomas asked, taking her hand. "No regrets," she said. "Only gratitude for the storm that showed us all who we really are." The purchased wife had become irreplaceable. The foreign bride had become the heart of her new home. And the woman they had once mocked had proven that sometimes the most valuable things come from the most unexpected places. And so, across these unforgiving lands, another tale drifts away with the wind. But before you go, tell me, what did Sigrid's story awaken in you? Have you ever been underestimated because you were different? Have you ever discovered strength you didn't know you possessed when the storms of life tested you? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your words matter here, and I read every single one. If this story of courage, transformation, and the power of being exactly who you are touched your heart, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear that their differences are their strengths. And don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Stories, because out here in the frontier of the human spirit, there are still so many tales of hope, grit, and unexpected heroes waiting to be told. Until the next story finds us, remember, sometimes the greatest Americans come from somewhere else, and the most precious things in life are the ones that can't be purchased. Keep writing, keep believing, and keep proving that your story, whatever it is, wherever you're from, matters. This is Wild West Stories. Thank you for listening.